Hello, and welcome once again to the Jazz Musician's Voice. My name is Jonah Jonathan, and thanks for tuning in. Today I have the wonderful opportunity to present for you an interview I conducted with jazz organist and pianist and educator Radam Schwartz. We sat down in his house out in Bloomfield, New Jersey, a little bit out of Newark, to discuss his life and the music. Radam is a fellow student of mine. He's actually graduated now, but a student at Rutgers University, and we are both in the Jazz History program, the master's program for Jazz History and Research. And my thesis is on the ethnography of jazz clubs in Harlem. And who better to interview about organ jazz than Radam Schwartz? He really knows about some of the spots that existed in Harlem, and there's not much writing about it. So he was a perfect person for me to be in touch with, and I decided to do an interview with him. So we talk about a lot of things in the interview. His early roots here in New York, his time in Boston, the time that he spent in the loft scene in the lower part of Manhattan, his time in Newark and that whole scene, meeting with mentors and working with them, especially Jack McDuff. We talk about a whole wide variety of issues on the Black American music. And Radam's just a very knowledgeable cat and really has some great stuff to say. He has a regular session at the club Crossroads, which he's been doing for a very long time. It's a Tuesday night jam session, and I totally recommend attending. And at the end of this interview, I sat down with Radam and we shot some video of him playing the B3, and we also shot some video of him playing the piano. So please make sure you check that out, and please stay tuned for future interviews, performances, and other videos pertaining to jazz. I've been collaborating with some great cats, including Martin Cohen and congahead.com. He's got some great Latin music. He's the founder of LP Percussion, and he's got a nice studio out in Montvale, New Jersey. And I've been working with him a little bit. I've also worked a little bit with Randy Cole, who is a great cinematographer and photographer in Montreal. We have some videos that we did together. And I also work with Martin Cohen's son. We did a little bit. So I definitely collaborating with many people. I've started a business now called jazzvideography.com. I've been shooting videos for people who need performances, interviews, teaching projects, all sorts of things. So please make sure you get in touch with me about that, and stay tuned. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today I have the wonderful opportunity to interview jazz organist and pianist Radam Schwartz. Now, Radam, let's talk about your early beginnings. Where do you come from? And tell us a little bit about your early years getting into music.
Well, I was born in New York City, in Washington Heights, Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. And my parents moved around the New York area, during my childhood. Brooklyn, Queens, Long Island, back to Queens. And I was originally, in 6th grade, I got interested in being in the band. I bought a clarinet, and I started playing clarinet in the band, and I got pretty good for a junior high school student. I played alto clarinet and clarinet. In high school, I also picked up the alto saxophone. And then in my junior year, I was given the opportunity by one of the people who were in the high school band, who played drums in the high school band, was actually also a bass player in a soul band. And he asked, a soul band at that time would be considered a garage band if they didn't have horns. But if they had horns, they could take it to the next level. And since I was the best saxophonist in the band, he asked me if I would join, and he also asked the trumpet player from the band to join. And we formed the band, or joined the band. After 3 weeks of working with a reel-to-reel tape, learning all the horn lines, we finally had a rehearsal, and that was probably one of the most euphoric musical experiences I had, because it's the first time really it came together. And that was the beginning, and I worked in that band for 2 years. In my senior year, one of the cats in the band was also into jazz, and he started turning me on to some of the jazz things he was listening to. Miles Davis, the Electric Miles Davis, Monk, Mingus, and I got into Ornette Coleman and Bill Evans as well, and I started listening and going into New York. Well, I was living in Queens, so I was just a subway stop away from the Village, and checking out some of the music that was going on in there. And so that's how I first got into being aware of it. I wasn't really playing any jazz, but I was listening to a whole lot of it.
And then at some point, you made the move to Berkeley, right?
Well, I first went to LIU before there was a jazz program, years and years before there was a jazz program.
That's Long Island?
Well, that's Long Island University. It's actually in downtown Brooklyn.
Okay.
It's across from Junior's, the famous deli.
Yeah.
And I went there, just as a liberal arts student. But there were a lot of jam sessions in that Brooklyn area at the time. There was a club on DeKalb Avenue and one on Fulton Street that I regularly went to.
Yeah.
And started, getting my jazz vocabulary together and sitting in as much as I could and trying to, get it. And then after that, I took a year off and worked in a recording studio mostly as a gopher, delivery boy, and doing some little other things with recording. And that summer I went up to Berkeley, and I started on a scholarship, for a summer scholarship, and then I went for another semester. And then after that I stayed in Boston for 3 years, working in a vegetarian restaurant, selling papers on the street. That was called hawking, or we were hawkers if you sold papers on the street. And then also and then also working as a musician. And finally I came back to New York, and and then I was more ready for the New York scene.
Yeah. So were there a lot of spots to play in Boston when you were?
There were more than there are now. It wasn't. There were a lot of different types of gigs. There were coffee shop gigs. There were vegetarian restaurant gigs. There were some club gigs. The restaurant I worked in was called the Route 1, and a lot of musicians would come by, so it was a good place to also make contact. There was also a piano in the club, which allowed me to practice a lot when I wasn't working. And so there was, it was a good scene. I ended up working in Charlie Mariano's fusion band, subbing about 2 or 3 gigs, and working with some other people and playing different types of music that was related to jazz, or even was just outright pop music.
Yeah, I mean that's great that you had that opportunity. And talking about New York, tell us how the scene was when you were there.
Well, when I came back to New York, I think it was probably 1974, and I was living on Chambers Street in a loft. There were 3 people who lived in the loft. On each side of the loft there was a living space, and in the middle where there was a rehearsal space where one of the guys who lived there, who actually was the owner of the loft, would rent it out. And a lot of avant-garde, so to speak, free jazz was being played there. Cecil Taylor's big band actually rehearsed there from time to time, and I met some of the cats who were in that band. And I would just go to the different jam sessions, which were mostly just avant-garde type of stuff. But there were also some compositional things that were going on as well. And I got to know a lot of the people in that scene, and of course I came to the conclusion that knowing how to play inside made you a better outside player. A lot of the people who were playing outside were struggling to play, sort of inside type of music because they knew it would make them a better player.
That's an interesting point. Tell us a little bit about some of the clubs on the avant-garde scene where you were living, because us younger people don't really know about those spots.
Well, there were the elite loft scene clubs like Studio Rivbay or Ali's Alley, which you could hear Jimmy Lyons and Dave Holland at the time. I mean, they played together. I saw Sam Rivers' band, of course, with Dave Holland and Barry Alshall.
Wow.
And but there were a lot of other little small lofts that were going on where they might cost $1 to get in, might cost $2 to get in, but you could go as an audience member, or you could go and you could sit in, and these were the type of places that I would play. And I obviously was not making any money doing this, so I wasn't really a professional musician, but I was playing with musicians who were playing that type of thing, that type of music, and I was writing that type of music as well.
Cool. And at some point you made the move to Newark, right?
Well, I actually moved to New Brunswick. I moved to New Brunswick, where I resided for maybe about 23 years.
Oh, wow.
In 1976, and I went down to study piano at Rutgers with Kenny Barron.
Okay.
And I also took a composition class with someone named Robert Maves. He was a composer. And there wasn't really a graduate program in jazz, so I sort of latched myself onto the graduate school at Rutgers to a degree, and took lessons with Kenny and these compositional lessons. Kenny at the time was working with Ron Carter and was constantly on the road, and the department was not as together to actually supply a sub when he wasn't there. So the lessons were sporadic,
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I started working for the first time as a musician, playing music, and I played in a band called the Neo-Bop Crisis Committee, which had a bunch of young cats in it. Michael Ridley, lifelong friend of mine who recently passed away, Reynaldo Jorge, Russell Branca, Freddie Lopez Sapero, and were some of the members of the group. And we used to have a gig every Monday night, so we would rehearse on Sunday and gig on Monday, And then I got my first gig really traveling with saxophonist Jimmy Ford, who was a swing musician. He had come up in the later part of the swing era. He had lived in Perth Amboy and had been in the Jimmy Lunsford Orchestra before he got drafted in the Army. And then after that, he formed some small. Oh, he also was in the Apollo Theater big band. And after he got out of the Army, he formed a smaller group and played like a swing style, sort of between swing style and like maybe on the Louis Jordan sort of tip type of thing. And that was, and the drummer in that band was Sam Bailey, who was a powerhouse swing drummer, just phenomenal, like almost like powerhouse, like Art Blakey was a powerhouse, but not with the bebop vocabulary. And he had actually been joined the Chick Webb band after Chick Webb had died, when Ella Fitzgerald was running that band. So he had worked in all the big bands in the Newark area.
Wow. So with him, you must have learned a lot. I mean, you have any anecdotes that he shared with you?
Well, I used to call Jimmy my surrogate father, because we were extremely close, and Jimmy's basic thing was working the East Coast. I think we made it as far south as like the Carolinas. We play in Richmond, we play in DC, Baltimore, New Haven, and he knew all the joints. Plus he knew all the Masonic lodges and the the Masons who were having dances. And he had 2 big hits, back in the late 40s, early 50s. One was Danny Boy. He covered Danny Boy, sort of like, what would probably be called race records at the time. And then he did the Easter Parade as a shuffle. And those are his two big hits. So, we had to play those tunes all the time. Plus all the other type of things. We played honky tonk. We played red top. We played just like, just all the swing arrangements that he always had his own little, type of, his own take on all the arrangements too. And he had a really beautiful sound on the tenor too, a really deep, rich sound with that swing vibrato.
That's great. And tell us a little bit about what happened next. Where did you start? Where did you start in your time period? Did you start playing organ?
Well, originally the Jimmy Ford gig was a piano gig. In fact, the bass player was originally was this guy named Jimmy Skank, who had worked with Nat King Cole, and there was also a guitarist named George Naha on that gig originally. And later, when Michael Ridley was also on that gig, Michael Ridley left. Leslie Ford came in. He was a trumpet player who I was later associated with. He formed the Jazz Institute of New Jersey, where I worked for 20 years. But I had done the gig with Jimmy. And somehow or another, I had also got to meet Duke Anderson, an important figure in my life, because Duke became like a mentor to me, and I took lessons with him. And Duke was a great arranger and pianist. He sounded on piano. He sounded like Art Tatum, but not as fast, in slow motion. And on organ, he also played organ like many of the black pianists at that time. He played organ like Wild Bill Davis. So. And he was a great arranger for a lot of the swing bands and swing singers of the area, arranged for Dinah Washington and Billie Holiday. And Duke had a big band that was funded by the National Endowment during the Carter administration. So in the late 70s, he asked me to play piano in that band. And so I got to meet a lot of the cats in Newark who were the rehearsals were always paid. So so when I got there, there'd be like 3 or 4 other pianists just waiting to make sure that I was going to show, because if I didn't show, they could get paid for just making a rehearsal.
Oh, wow.
And that would happen with all the other instruments.
Yeah.
So through him, I met Harold Van Pelt, who was a Barry player who was also a great arrangement. He had the hippest charts of all the small bands in Newark.
Yeah.
And at one point, he had Woody Shaw, Wayne Shorter, Stosh of Laughlin in his band. He had an all-star band, Eddie Gladden, and I was working with him, and at one point, Al Hibler was the featured vocalist with his band, and somebody asked me for my number because Al was blind. He didn't take care of business. Somebody else asked me for the number, and then I got a call to work with Al Hibler at the Mirage in Newark, and after that, I went to Europe with Al Hibler. And when I came back after about 2.5 months, I was looking for a gig. I called somebody named Mickey Tucker, a great pianist from Newark. He was just one of the many calls I made to see if there were any gigs available. And he said, come to this jam session. And I went to the jam session, which was on Central Avenue at a place called Sherry's. But it was also called Dudes and Autumns. It went through different names. It had a marquee in the front of it. I think it might be a church now. But anyhow, I went to this session. I didn't know that Mickey also played organ. And it was an organ session. And somewhere down the line, he called me up to play. And I didn't know, I couldn't walk a bass line in comp or walk a bass line in solo. I didn't even know that the notes on the farmost left side were called presets. That didn't give you a sound, it just switched the sound.
Yeah.
So I was totally confused, and at that time, Leo Johnson and Eddie Crawford, who were on that gig, were in this corner, and they were laughing at me, struggling with trying to make the thing work. And I guess it was sort of funny. Leo, to this day, remembers doing that, and and the thing is, at that point, a friend of mine named Alan Watson came up and he hit me to some of the stuff because he was also a pianist trying to learn how to play organ, And then the two of us got together on a weekly basis to learn how to actually play organ. And we would shed together all the time. And in fact, I pointed to you before that this cigarette burn on my piano is from Alan Watson, because I went upstairs to get a cup of coffee. I came down, he had this cigarette burning on the, and I got mad at him, but that's, he and I were, really tight for that period because we were trying to learn all the nuances of playing organ. And he also hooked me up with my first portable organ because he was working for a keyboard company. It was an organ called a Viscount organ. It was from Italy. And so I had an instrument to actually make gigs on as well.
Oh, that's great, and it's a totally different scene, the organ scene. It's not really talked about much in jazz. Tell us a little bit about Newark and all the clubs that frequented.
My first gig in Newark was a piano gig at a club called Midas Gold. It was one of the many clubs, like black clubs, where the bandstand was behind the bar. It was on Central Avenue. It was one of the owners. There was two owners. One was a cop, so a lot of the black cops would come and hang out at Midas Gold, and they had a lot of fish tanks there too. And it was just a great place to play, And I had already been working with Jimmy Ford. We had worked at other places in New Jersey, in Plainfield and Piscataway and Perth Amboy. So it was not a total surprise, but I was learning, how this type of special music got played and how the audience reacts to it and different nuances like that. There were just so many clubs in Newark at the time. There were organ clubs and some piano clubs, like Sparky J's had an organ and a piano. But across the street from Sparky's was the Key Club, which was just a straight out organ club. And it was actually a lot of people, they would make a night out of it. They would make sure they would go to Sparky's or go to the Key Club. And both of them had both local and national acts, so that, it wouldn't be unheard of to see at the Key Club somebody like Rahsaan Roland Kirk working with an organ group, and you can go across the street and hear somebody as well,
Wow, yeah.
And there was also a lot of other clubs. There was Mr. West. There were many clubs on Branford Place. There was Carl's Corner. There was Club Elegant. And as you spread out through the Newark area and into East Orange, there was quite a few clubs that had jazz during at least a couple nights a week. There was also a club in Irvington called Tweeds that I used to work at that actually had an acoustic piano in it, run by this guy named Bill Osborne. And there was Bogies. There was in East Orange, there was the Living Room that turned into La Sala. There was just a lot of music going on.
Wow, it's a completely different time from today. There's very few clubs, but that's amazing to get some insight into a period of time where there were so many places to play. And I know now you work at Crossroads a lot.
Every Tuesday.
Tell us a little bit about Crossroads. I know you had a Tuesday night jam session at another club before that.
Well, in East Orange, when I was originally, I had a gig, with the Neo Bop Crisis Committee, and it was Michael Ridley's gig, and the drummer we normally used couldn't make it, so he hired a drummer named Rudy Walker, who's still on the scene today. And on the gig, Rudy told me that he did this jam session at the Peppermint Lounge every Tuesday. So I went over to the Peppermint, and they had these outrageous jam sessions with incredible musicians coming in, and Nat Phipps was the piano player. He had worked with Wayne Shorter. The Phipps family and the Shorter family sort of very tight, and also Calvin Ridley on bass. And there's just so many great musicians who came by. And the second week I was there, Dave Schnitter, who was from Newark, was working with Art Blakey, brought down Bobby Watson, who had just got the gig with the Messengers. So, this was a place where all sorts of musicians would come in, George Benson, Woody Shore, and whatever. And so in '86, I started working. By then it had transferred over to being an organ jam session. and I started working there with Don Williams and Gary Moore. And I was there for 11 years. And when the Peppermint closed down, about 2 weeks later, we started at Crossroads in Garwood, that same group. And that's where I still am working. It'll be 15 years this August that will be there.
Congrats, that's a nice long time to have a spot.
Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about Harlem now, because my thesis project is on the ethnography of jazz clubs in Harlem through the different times, and there's not much written about the organ scene, which was pretty happening in Harlem. So tell me a little bit about what you know about the organ scene.
Okay, well, obviously I wasn't around in the 50s, but I've done some research, and I know that from the early 1950s through the mid 80s, of all the clubs in black neighborhoods, those clubs that had were distinctively had a black personality to them, 80% of them were organ clubs or had organ at times in them. And the thing is, this was the type of music that most black people would say is the type of jazz that they listen to. And yet the fact is that if you look at all jazz history, they don't mention that at all, which leads you to wonder if there's an endemic situation happening here where just the whole history of jazz is told from the perspective of music that was played in front of a white audience, primarily by black musicians, but still that the white audience was the audience that jazz history is told. And so when I first came into playing clubs in Harlem, the first gig I had in Harlem playing organ was at La Famille, where I had a very long working relationship there. I came in the 80s, and I kept playing up until the time they really closed. At one point I was working the jam sessions on Wednesday and Sunday night and playing weekends there. But there were a lot of other great organists who came through. And in fact, the organ I have here is the organ from La Famille, which used to be Jack McDuff's organ. One of his girlfriends was Miss B, who ran La Famille, and Miss B was on the outside. She had a very hard exterior,
Yeah.
She'd always, seem hard, and she'd say about me, and she was a stickler for a time, and I was always a little bit late, and she said, I don't understand why that white boy can never be on time, but later on, you see that there was a soft interior to her, because at one point I didn't have anybody to watch my kids, and I took them to the club, and she made sure they went upstairs to the restaurant and ate, and were taken care of really well, and so, but in any case, I played in La Famille probably in the mid 80s, and also
Where was that located?
La Famille was on 5th Avenue and between 125th and 124th.
Wow.
And they had a big canopy that went out because the street was really wide. The sidewalk was wide, and a big canopy that went halfway out to the sidewalk. And it was, there'd be a lot of tourists, but there were also a lot of regulars who come despite, no matter who was playing. And there were a lot of, Charles Erlin played there, Lonnie Smith played there, Reuben Wilson. When I first came in, there was the first gig I did in Harlem was not at La Famille. It was at a place called Northern Lights with Vinnie Knight. And I went down to La Famille that night, and I heard this organist named Charles Williams playing. And he had an incredible groove. So that was but that was the first regular gig I had. And if you went up the street, they by a block away on 125th, a block away from the Apollo, they had the Baby Grand, which was run by Eddie Henderson's mother, Thelma, and that had a Fender Rhodes and a Hammond B3 organ in there. And of course, up the street between another club between 125th and 124th on 7th Avenue was Showman's, which now is relocated on 125th and Morningside. And a couple blocks away, there was a club called Lickety Split, where they had an organ, which was a blonde organ, meaning the wood was light colored.
Wow, that's cool. And most of these are B3s, right?
That was a B3, yeah. I think that was a B2, in fact.
Okay.
Was a blonde colored B2. And, and then if you just went up, like up on Lenox Avenue, there was a club called Chris's that had an organ in there, where I played on New Year's Eve. And, so this is in the 80s that I'm talking about. Of course, I also played at a club called Mark IV with a singer named Bobby Curtis and a variety of other people, which was like more a blues R&B club. But up the street, this was on St. Nicholas Avenue, and that's on 146 and St. Nick. But of course, up the street, which became St. Nick's Pub, was Dude's Lounge, where Jack McDuff would be playing whenever he wasn't in town. That was Jack's home in New York when he wasn't on the road. And so you could go up from, when I was on break, I would go up to hear Jack play.
Wow, and there you said there was another spot on 145th in St. Nick's, right?
145th and St. Nick's was Sutton's. Sutton's was not an organ club, by the way. Sutton's they had a upright piano. But when I played there with Arthur Prysock, because I was on the road previous to that with Arthur Prysock playing organ, when I played there, we brought an organ in.
So tell us a little bit about the logistics of bringing an organ. Would you carry it in a van? How would you do it?
Well, when I was with Arthur Prysock from 1983 and 84, Arthur didn't have what we call organ movers or organ dollies, so we had to grab it from the bottom and move it in. The drummer, Don Williams, who I work with on Tuesdays at Crossroads, at that time, he's a big guy and he's very strong, and he'd take one side, and my job was to crawl in the back of the bus, and I crawl underneath the organ and lift it off this thing they built, which kept the organ from moving, and then move it to the side, where then Arthur's cousin, whose name was Eddie Robinson, would grab it with the guitarist sometimes, and they would take it in. But my job was to crawl underneath the organ and lift it out and give it to them.
Wow. Yeah.
So one time we were moving into this place called Dino's in Philly, and it had very steep stairs, and me and the guitarist Kenny Wessel were on the top moving the organ, and the organ slipped out, and Don was on the bottom.
Oh, wow.
And he's holding the organ because there's nowhere to go. I mean, it's not like if the organ was going, he was going. And he finally held it together, and then he said, "It said not in exactly these terms. As soon as we get upstairs, I'm going to kick your, you know what."
Yeah.
So it was hard. But nowadays, when I move an organ, I have the actual organ dollies that hook on, and they're on wheels. So basically, you can use a certain amount of leverage and just use the wheels to move it on. As long as there's no stairs, it's fine.
Wow, that's some heavy logistics. I mean, as a bassist, we complain, but as an organist or a drummer, I mean,
no comparison.
Yeah. Even a drummer, it's easier. An organ is like all the deal. I guess we'll do a little video of you playing your organ here.
Okay.
What kind of organ is that, by the way?
This is a B3 organ. This is the organ from La Famille, and like I said, it was Jack McDuff's organ.
Yeah, so it was a B3.
And every organ has its own sound, and this sometimes you can categorize it by when it was made. The later organs that were made in the 70s usually are brighter on the top end, but may not have as strong a bass. And those in the 50s are usually have a stronger bass and a warmer mid-range, but each organ has its own individual sound.
That's cool, it's just like any wooden instrument. They all have their unique sounds, bass, especially.
Well, the organ is even though it's wrapped in a wood thing, though it is an electronic instrument.
Yeah.
And it's just the way, for whatever reason it is, for whatever
Assembled.
reason the electronics are there it's fed into a tone wheel, and whatever each one has its own way it came out.
That's cool. So we'll talk a little bit more about Harlem, but let's talk a little bit about organ and some advice that you have for young organists who are getting started playing jazz organ, and some pointers you might have. And
well, when you play an organ, the thing I learned with Arthur Prysock, which was I was already playing organ, but what I really learned from him is the basis of getting everything. The bass is the primary thing. Arthur Prysock's gig was not a solo gig for me. It's about playing the right chords, backing up a singer, and grooving on the tunes that groove. There was no fast tempo tunes unless we were playing instrumentals before he came on. So the bottom line is my main role was to supply a groove, to learn how to get different sounds out of the organ, and to play the bass when he sang ballads. So much nowadays is young organists come up, they want to, show what they can do on the right-hand side of it, and everything is hip on the right-hand side, but on the left hand suffers for it. And the first thing you have to concentrate, 80% of your concentration is in getting that bass line grooving with the drummer. No matter what type of thing, if it's up-tempo, if it's a Latin tune, if it's some odd type of rhythm or whatever, funk or whatever, you have to get that bass. You got to concentrate on that, and that's the hardest thing for a pianist to adjust to. As I said, I was lucky because I came up in a situation where I wasn't expected to. My soloing was not of consequence. What was important was that I made the band sound good, and since there's no. The relationship between an organist and a drummer is important too, because you can't just come with a certain prescribed feel. You have to make it work with the specific drummer that you're working with. So you will play differently, get a different groove with different types of drummers. And that's the thing that I find really missing from some of the younger organists that I hear.
Cool. That's good to get that for people who are watching this who are organists. Let's go back to Harlem clubs. I want to talk about the culture of the clubs. Give us a particular night you can remember. Tell us a little bit about who was in the audience, what was the energy like there, some anecdotes.
Well, there's a certain thing about the relationship between a musician and a primarily a black audience. I mean, it's different. It's a whole different scene, and this is true about Newark as well. But I could tell you, like the night at La Famille where Jack McDuff came in, and he sat in the front purposely and started heckling me. But at the end of the night, he came up and we played these songs together, and there was only one organ, so he would play a little, and he'd jump up, and I'd jump down, and I'd play a little. I'd jump to the other side, he'd come back in, and the crowd was going wild.
Wow.
I mean, here's a term that you probably don't hear too much at college, but we used to have a term called taking house. Taking house meant like when the audience was just totally into it and screaming and yelling, and everything you were doing they were paying attention to. And it's a great feeling. It's a wondrous feeling of playing music in that type of environment. If you can make it happen like that. There's just so many. The other thing about back in the day, like it wouldn't be like when I was working at the Baby Grand, it would be no big deal if sometimes I worked there with Della Griffin, if Etta Jones or Irene Reed would come in and sit in, or other great musicians, and it just became every club, opened itself up for people to come in and sit in at a certain time.
That's really cool, and I guess we get a little taste of that when you go to Crossroads. They have a little bit of the.
Well, a lot of the audience, by the way, from Crossroads came with us from the Peppermint Lounge. At least initially, we had like a large contingent of people from the Peppermint Lounge who came, so they expected the same thing that they were getting at the Peppermint Lounge at Crossroads.
Yeah. Well, That's really great. Any other clubs that we haven't talked about in Harlem that you can remember?
There probably are. Well, about a year and a half ago, I played a gig at this Whole Foods on the in the, I forget what it was, maybe a 99th Street or 100th Street or something.
Okay, 100th Street and I think it's like Amsterdam.
Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Well, do you know there used to be a club there that I used to play there?
Interesting.
I'm trying to think of the name of that club. It's not Michael's, but there was a club right there, and I just realized it. I mean, when I pulled up there, I had no idea, but that club was Charles Erlin used to play there. I played there with Arthur Prysock. Willis Jackson played there. Just so many people played at that club on that street. I just can't think of the name offhand, but then I was playing a Jazzmobile gig, and somebody interviewed me about that club where Whole Foods is. So I mean, there were just like along 125th Street, there were at least 4 or 5 clubs. Then you have Showman's, you had La Familia, Chris's, Lickety Split. I'm just trying to think of the clubs at that time, but it was a frequent thing, and that there were clubs in that area.
Did you ever get a chance to attend Small's Paradise, or was that a little
No,
bit before?
Small's Paradise was before my time. I've heard of things about Small's Paradise. That I know it was, that Small's Paradise, even before Jimmy Smith came and made us. That was his where he got signed to Blue Note Records in 1955, but it had been an organ club even before then in the 50s. The interesting thing is Atlantic City also has a very interesting organ history, pre-Jimmy Smith history, because there were 3 clubs in the 50s, or major organ clubs in Atlantic City. There was Club Harlem, Gracie's Little Belmont, and the Winter Garden, which were all organ clubs on Kentucky Avenue. And so it wouldn't be unheard of at the time when the Duke Ellington Orchestra might be not working for them to come down and play with Wild Bill Davis, for example, at Gracie's or Club Harlem. And there was a famous drummer who used to work there named Chris Colombo, who was Sonny Payne's father.
Wow. So that's it's really amazing to hear about the organ scene, and that really ties into something we were talking about the other day, which is that the way that black music is written about, or the way jazz is written about, is for black musicians playing to white audiences, but not including the black audiences. Could you talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on that, and about Nicholas Payton and his whole thing, Black American music? The whole thing kind of ties in. I know he was not the originator, but...
Well, of course, when I was coming up, Rahsaan Roland Kirk was saying, great black music, let's just call this music great black music,
Yeah.
So it's not a totally new concept. On the thing about the audience thing, the way I came to this I was also a history student at the master's program over at Rutgers, Newark. And the thing is, I'm looking at the literature at the library, the IJS. I'm looking through all the anthologies, the Lewis Porter anthologies, the Grove Dictionary, the Grove Encyclopedia of Jazz, the Martin anthology, Dr. Henry Martin's anthology. I'm looking at all these anthologies that I like to stack up here, and I'm coming up with like maybe 8 or 9 paragraphs on organ jazz. Now, knowing how important organ jazz was from my experience of playing music, not only as an organist, but before I was an organist, knowing how many organ clubs there were in the black communities, I started to wonder why. And then also for the fact that in all the performance programs, in the 280 so odd college programs that teach jazz, only one has an jazz organ major.
Yeah.
And that's Capital University in Columbus, Ohio.
Wow. Wow.
So I'm saying to myself, what's the reason for this? It's just not coincidence. So it made me think, well, jazz history is written from the point of view of 75 to 80% about black musicians playing for white audiences. Then the other part is about white musicians playing for white audiences. But what never gets discussed is black musicians playing for black audiences and white musicians playing for black audiences. So that is the perspective that is being taken. And then you also have to take into account that playing in front of a black audience, you actually play differently than you play in front of a white audience. The demand for what they want to hear is somewhat different. And the aspects that are different, they have to hear more blues-oriented stuff. The depth of the beat has got to be greater. The importance of the depth of the beat, not metronomic accuracy, and how much it's swinging. Those aspects are important ingredients in the way you have to play. And everybody knows, every musician knows that the audience has some effect upon what they play. That's even if you don't think about it consciously, every musician subliminally knows that.
Yeah.
Now you can choose to play and cater to the audience's demand, and maybe you'll get another gig, or you can choose to defy it, and then you probably won't get another gig. But either way, you are aware of it. So since you take into account that as a musician, you're aware of that. If you're playing to a black audience, which is what's sometimes called on the Chitlin circuit or on the organ jazz circuit, the jazz organ circuit, you played a certain way. And it didn't mean that the music was in any way less cerebral, but it just meant that the music had these ingredients to it. And if you even go back, before organ, you look at what they talk about, Louis Armstrong's first gig that they talk about his gig with Fate Marble on the riverboats. Well, that was in front of a white audience. Nothing about really what he was playing in front of black audiences. Talk about Fletcher Henderson. His first gig is at Roseland, which is an all-white audience. You talk about Duke Ellington. You talk about the Cotton Club. And it keeps going on and on all the way up until the 80s or 90s. And that's how jazz history is told. And what's being neglected is the actual ingredients that made this music feasible to the black audience. Aside from that, that's where the music was actually, fermented. That's where it actually grew out of before it so-called emerged onto the white scene. It was showcased maybe on a greater stage in front of white audiences, but it was actually, created in front of black audiences. So this is the thing that is missing in the way that jazz history and jazz performance is being taught. Now, to Nicholas Payton's comments, we've used the word jazz numerous times in this interview, and I know that back in the 70s, a lot of black musicians coined the term, this music called jazz, because they didn't want to just embrace the term jazz, but they didn't quite divorce themselves from it completely. And they would even say real jazz, meaning that real jazz, before WBGO used that phrase, real jazz sort of meant jazz that's really rooted in, the basics of what we're playing.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is, I think that, so if I have no disagreement with his basic premise, though, that this music, that is black American music, because this is the place where it was created from, and I think that it's also the other aspect that I think he disregards a little bit, at least from I've seen from his interview, is that he says because it was the rhythm that was so important, but there's other aspects of the music that's non-European, that's not only that's not European. Like, for example, there's a whole different harmonic system, there's a whole different melodic system that's not really European and needs to be looked at from a theoretical point of view, because most theory is also trying to use a European paradigm to examine this music that doesn't really fit it. It's a la Henry Martin using the Schenkerian system. So I don't think that system works, and so I'm trying myself to write a book on blues analysis, which takes the analytical aspects of what jazz is, not rhythmic, because it's very hard to talk about rhythm, to analyze it, because it's, it just moves on, and it's, but especially when you're talking about groove or swinging, that's like a very hard thing to analyze. I've never, really understood how you could really translate that other than to look at how an audience reacts to it. But there are other aspects. So if you look at Rhapsody in Blue, for example, the rhythm is all European, but there's other aspects of it that are blues oriented.
Yeah, so that's, thanks for enlightening us on that. You're the first real cat I interviewed since I did a controversial interview with Alex Hoffman. I want to get your thoughts on some of his statements, because I think it's important to get the response to kind of the craziness, so to speak, of what he said.
I think the problem with his generation of musicians is there's no connect to the history and the grandness of the history of this music. The beauty of it, that the reason I was attracted to it, for me, when I went and I saw someone like Jimi Anderson, who was a tenor saxophonist from the Newark area, and Jimmy would be, and he, of the two, Jimmy was he was a very brash cat. He would tell you what he thought in no uncertain terms. So like Eddie Lockjaw Davis was when I worked with him. He just tell you, you're not swinging, and he'd curse you out, and then he'd say, don't take it personally, it's just about the music. But I see him practicing like hours and hours and hours, and he's just got a gig down the street at a bar, but he wants the music to be so beautiful that he wants to practice. And this is the beauty of some of the music, where it's something that someone like Alex Hoffman will never really understand, that if he can make the statements he made. All the people that I came up with in Newark, of that generation knew Wayne. Wayne was not a superstar to them. Wayne Shorter, he was a compatriot, a comrade, that they just treated as someone fortunate enough to get some major gigs and play in major venues, but he was just a musician like all of the rest of them. And, he devoted his life to this music. So, anybody who devotes their life, whether they're famous or not famous, but they devoted their life to this music, I'm not talking in their 20s. I don't know where he's going to be when he's in his 40s. But if anybody who's devoted their life to this music, first of all, needs to be given a certain amount of respect.
Yeah, respect is certainly important, and it's great to get your take on it, especially knowing the Newark musicians and kind of understanding that scene and kind of the scene that Wayne might have come out of.
I talked about the Phipps family, and one of my good friends who recently passed away was Billie Phipps. I played on his last record before about a year and a half or 2 years before he passed away. One of the most beautiful cats I met in my life. I can't think of a better person than him. And I did an interview with him, in fact, where he talked about his connection to the Shorters and how the Phipps and the Shorters were always, people thought they were related, but they weren't, but they were just so close.
Yeah.
And they played together in many bands, and the Phipps family is sometimes called the first jazz family in Newark. So, even though I've never met the Shorters, I know a great deal about them from Billie Phipps and, of course, Nat Phipps and just everybody in Newark.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's thanks for enlightening us on your life and such. Let's talk a little bit about how you got into education, because you're an educator, and I want to explore that side of your career. Tell us how you got involved in teaching.
You know, when I came off the road with Arthur Prysock, and I got this gig with this singer named Bobby Curtis, and I wanted to leave that gig. It was more like a, it was a commercial gig. It wasn't really a jazz gig, and I really, you know, I could try to play that music, but I really didn't want to do that. And one of the things I did is I started working at Rutgers University as an accompanist, and I accompanied dance, theater, and vocal classes. And through that, I also started doing that at this arts high school. So one of the things I noticed is at this arts high school, Middlesex County Arts High School, they didn't have a jazz program. They had all these other classical European-oriented programs, but no jazz program. And I went to the lady who was running it, Estelle Hassenbach, and I mentioned it to her. And she said to me, well, people tell me that before you can play jazz, you have to really know classical European music. Basically, that's what she said. And I said, well, I don't believe that's the case for Errol Garner or for Louis Armstrong, for example. They played jazz and they didn't study European music per se. Not that it's wrong to do it that way, but it's not the only way. There's many pathways to the garden, you know. So anyhow, eventually they were trying to get some sort of cultural diversity, and her hand was sort of forced to start a jazz program. And at that point, she hired me to be the assistant of Bob Ackerman. The second year that we did it, Bob Ackerman ended up taking a gig in Spain and was gone for 2 months. And I basically ran the class, and they were very happy with me. So the next year, I ran the class with one of my friends, Tommy Gryce, Gigi Gryce's brother. And we ran that class for about 5 or 6 years. And during that time, Leslie Ford, who I had known as a musician, had played in Duke Anderson's band, was trying to form this organization called the Jazz Institute of New Jersey. And I always think that Leslie is a visionary, because way before the Jazz for Teens and NJ PAC or Jazz House Kids, where I'm teaching now, or any of these programs that are proliferating, all these areas around here, before they even thought about having a program for that involved jazz and high school and junior high school kids, he came up with this idea. And he also came up with the idea that at this time he saw that the scene was being changed from people learning, from this apprentice-master relationship to going to college and learning in college. And so middle-class kids could buy lessons, could afford lessons, and therefore they are at an advantage over kids who couldn't do that. So there had to be some way for everybody to get the basic skills to get ready for college, and that was his vision. And even though I don't think he would mind me saying he was not a great administrator, his whole concept to get this thing started was just a visionary type of idea, and which allowed me to develop a concept of how to teach too, how to teach this music, and how trial and error and learning. And I've produced 3 or 4 generations of musicians now who've come through different programs that I've been involved with, whether it be Jazz Connections, which was at Montclair State University, or whether it was the Jazz Institute of New Jersey, whether it's at the Arts High School or Jazz House Kids program. And I've just developed a method for teaching this music. And in 2012, for example, my ensemble won first place nationally at the Charles Mingus competition through Jazz House Kids. And,
wow, that's great, yeah.
And so I've had it's been very rewarding, and I spend a lot. I think about teaching as much as I do about playing. Really, it's a great thing to be able to give the music, and I give it in a certain way that sort of reflects the lessons I got with Duke Anderson back in the day.
Wow, so it's really great that you're a teacher and really turning out young musicians and instilling knowledge for them. What advice do you have for young musicians in general about this music?
Well, are you talking from a standpoint of execution and theory, or from a standpoint of life?
Well, just the theory and life. I mean, you could start with the theoretical side and also.
Well, I have I take it from a vantage point of building vocabulary and using that vocabulary to improvise. I basically, from the beginner standpoint, I use two different types of vocabulary. Sometimes they overlap, but the two types of vocabulary are blues-oriented patterns that derive from the blues. They're either major or minor, pentatonic, blues scale, gospel scale, whatever you want to call them. And those patterns can work over a family of chords. So you learn how you can use how certain chords create a family, and then you can use one pentatonic. Then you also can use that in inverse, which means that you can take a one scale and make it work. Not one scale, you can use one chord and make many different pentatonics on that one chord, because that's also a different way of looking at it. Then you also have to learn how to define the chord through your melodic patterns. You can't play a bass line, for example, if it doesn't define a chord, and anybody should be able to play a solo and without a rhythm section, somebody say, oh yes, you're playing this particular tune over changes, And so that's the basic way to build vocabulary, at least initially. Then you get into the nuances of how to expand that theory, and how to see one chord and play two chords, how to see one chord, play three chords, et cetera, and then how you incorporate different concepts into one pattern, combination patterns, in other words. So that's the linear concept of playing. Of course, there's also how a rhythm section works and how to groove, which is very important. It's something overlooked, of course, and and every instrument has its role, and that's another aspect of what you teach, of course. As far as life lessons, I came up at a time like where the concept of paying your dues was important. The concept that you respected the musicians who came before, even if you were playing something radically different. The fact that paying your dues is an important thing, because you take these 22 and 23-year-olds with all the technique in the world and all the schooling that we didn't get, or the generations before didn't get, but what's missing? And there's something missing that they had that they're not getting. And maybe they don't want to get. When I was with Arthur Prysock, for example, we were traveling in a bus with no air conditioning. It was so hot we had to close the windows, and we had to stop every half hour to take a towel and put it over our heads, a wet towel and put it over our heads, And that was, that's in a way paying dues. But paying dues is also, playing on a bandstand and someone telling you can't play, nobody, and not thinking that someone's vibing you. There's Jimi Anderson, for example, when I was playing with him at the Tremont Lounge in East Orange, there was a drummer who came in, I won't mention his name, and we were playing a medium tempo thing, and he was a young drummer at the time, and he kept speeding up, and Jimmy turned around and kept yelling at him, cursing at him, and telling him not to speed up. And finally the cat got to Jimmy and said, I'm tired of you yelling at me, just let me play, right? Jimmy said, okay. And the next week the cat came and he didn't get called up, and the next week he came and he didn't get called up, and in fact the person just didn't exist to Jimmy anymore. You know what I mean? He didn't feel like arguing over basic concepts of the music. You know what I mean? And but if you do it nowadays, everybody thinks you're vibing them. The young cats think you're vibing them. A lot of times now, there's a lot of receptive young cats out here. But I'm just saying, in general, it's a different type of system here, and also it's a system where the students have a little bit more power than they had before, because as much as Eddie Lockjaw Davis yelled at me every moment that I was basically on the bandstand, you know, I mean, nowadays if a college professor did that, he'd be in the dean's answering to the dean, you know, why are you picking on this kid?
Yeah, that's unfortunate, you know, because it's important to get that knowledge from the elders in this music, and it's kind of watered down now, you know. But fortunately, if you're a young cat hanging on the scene, you will experience that from an older cat. At least I did when I was first coming to New York. I was 17, and I was getting knowledge from Harry Whitaker, of all people. And, you know, rest his soul, he passed away, but he was hard on me. But then later he came back, and he kind of was like, oh, you're doing better, you know, and he kind of, that's important, you know, the teacher mentorship type thing. But yeah, thanks for giving us that. And
one time, as much as Jimi Anderson, for example, would be barking at me on the bandstand, there was this time where we were playing, and he played this stuff, and he told me to drop out so he could just play with the drummer. And there was this, he played this passage, and he was playing it to lead me back in, and it wasn't right at the top of the tune, and I just felt that's what he did, and I came back in on it, and the band just like exploded from that point. And after that, we were backstage, and, you know, and he was just like hugging me, you know, like he said, okay, you know, you got it, you know. So
yeah,
there was a lot of, you know, there's a lot of very poignant points being made, but there was also, you know, when you got it, you got a reward, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, Radam, thanks so much for instilling your knowledge and giving us such a great interview.
Thanks for having me.